Afternoon. I am Rafael. Um, Good afternoon.
Okay, go ahead.
Good
You may
afternoon.
continue your discussion.
Good afternoon. I am Rafael L. Jucapo. Hello po. Good afternoon. Nakikita po?
Yes, go
Hello
ahead.
po. Good afternoon. I am Rafael L. Jucampo Jr. and I will tackle about the cluster sampling, multi-stage sampling, and non-probability sampling, quota sampling. Next slide, please. So what is cluster sampling? Cluster sampling is a probability sampling technique where researchers divide the population into multiple groups for research. Group means cluster or cluster. Researchers then select random groups with a simple random or systematic random sampling technique for data collection and data analysis. Next. So cluster sampling. So what is the cluster sampling? It defines or definition, steps, tips, methods, samples, advantages, applications. So that is the cluster sampling. Okay, so consider a scenario where an organization is looking to survey the performance of smartphones across Germany. So they can divide the entire country's population into sites or clusters and select further towns with the highest population and also filter those using mobile phones. So that is for our example. So step 1, so decide the target audience and also the sample size. For example, 50, 100, or 30. So that is the sample size. So next, step 2. So create and evaluate sampling frames. Create a sampling frame by using either an existing framework or create a new one for a target audience. May existing framework ka na, kukuha ka ng framework or may framework ka na target, so yun yung susundin mo or yung gagawa ka ng iyong framework. So yan, evaluate the framework based on coverage and clustering and make adjustment accordingly. So next, step 3, determine groups. Determine the number of groups by including the same average member in each group. So yun. Next. Step 4. Choose cluster by applying the random selection. Step 5. Create subtypes. It is bifurcated into two stage by multi-stage subtypes based on the number of steps followed by the researcher to from to form cluster. Yan. Sige. Next step, please. So, the sampling technique is used in an area or geographical cluster sampling for a market research. A broad geographic area can be expensive to survey in comparison to surveys that are sent to clusters that are divided based on region. The sample numbers have to be increased to achieve accurate results, but the cost saving involved make the process of rising cluster attainable. So that is the applications of cluster sampling. Next. So what is the multi-stage sampling? So the multi-stage sampling is defined as sampling method that divides the population into groups or cluster for conducting research. It is a complex form of cluster sampling, sometimes also known as multi-stage cluster sampling. During this sampling method, significant cluster of the selected people are split into subgroups, split into two. So that is the various stage to make it simpler for primary data collection. So that is the definition of the multi-stage sampling. Next. So this is the example of the multi-stage sampling. So multi-stage sampling has steps also. It has a definition, application, advantages, example, types, and tips. So that is the multi-stage sampling. Next. So, step 1, choose a sampling frame. Consider the population of interest. Halimbawa, interest mo na sa psychology, and then sa research. What specific research sa psychology, sa SPED, or sa education, etc. So, the researcher allocates a number to every groups and selects a small sample of relevant separate group. Step 2, select a sampling frame of relevant separate subgroups. Do this frame related different discrete groups selected in the previous stage. So go back on the step 1. So step 3, repeat the second step if necessary. Step 4, using some variation of probability sampling, choose the member of the sample group from the subgroups. Sige. All right. Next slide, please. So, application of multi-stage sampling. Multi-stage sampling is applied mainly to these areas. Applied to a multi-stage design where the population is too fast, the research every individual is impossible, to gather student perception from student belonging to various colleges studying different courses and located throughout the country. Right. Next slide, please. Next. See. 3. To survey employees of a multinational company belonging to multiple location in a multiple countries. 4. Government bureaus use this method all the time to draw interference from population. Multi-phase sampling reduces the time taken to research an area. It also keeps a tab on the cost of the research. The information collected from the samples is used to draw interferences and population as a whole. So, binubuo talaga siya. All right. Next. Sige. Example, let us consider the example location at the USA, United States of America. The research goal is to assess the online spending trends of the people in the US through the online questionnaire. Oh, ngayon ginagamit na natin siya, of course, Google Forms. Research can form their sample groups comprising 200 households in the following manner. First, choose the number of states using sample random sampling or any other probability sampling. For example, select 10 states, sorry. Second, choose 5 districts with each state using the systematic sampling method or any other probability sampling. Third, choose 4 households from each district using a systematic sampling or simple random sampling method, and you will end up 200 houses that you can include in the sample for each research. Next. Non-probability quota sampling. So it defines quota sampling is defined as a non-probability sampling method in which researchers create a sample involving individuals to represent a population. Researchers choose these individuals according to the specific traits or qualities. They decided to create quotas so that the market research sample can be useful in collecting data. These samples can be generalized to the entire population. The final subset will be decided only according to the interviewers or the researchers' knowledge of the population. Okay, all right. So that is the quota sampling. Next, next, please. All right, thank you. So for the example, let's look at the basic example of quota sampling. A researcher wants to survey individuals about the smartphone like Oppo, like Vivo, like Apple, like kung ano pa diyang brand na yan. Uh, what what about what smartphone brand they prefer? He or she considered a sample size of 500 respondents. Also, he or she only interested in surveying 10 states in the US. Example, here's how the research can be divided into the population by quotas. Gender, 250 males and 250 females. Age bracket, 100 respondents, each between ages of 16 to 20, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, and 51 up. All right. Employment. So employment status, for example, 350 employed and 150 unemployed. Researchers apply further nested quotas. For example, out of 150 unemployed people, 100 must be a students and 50 are unemployed. All right. Location, 50 responses per state. All right. So next slide, please. So depending on the types of the research can apply quotas based on the sampling frames. It is not necessary for the researcher to divide the quotas equally. He or she divides the quotas as per his or her need, as shown as the example where the researchers interviews 350 employed and 150 unemployed individuals. 100 are students and 50 are unemployed people. All right. Random sampling can be conducted to reach out to the respondents. Next, please. So probability sampling techniques involves a significant amount of uh, rules that researchers need to follow to form samples. But since quota sampling is a non-probability sampling technique, there are no rules for formally creating samples. Usually, there are 4 steps to form a sample. Here are the steps. First is to divide the population into subgroups. With the stratified sampling, the researcher bifurcates the entire population into mutual exhaustive subgroups. The elements of each of the subgroups becomes a part of only one of those subgroups. Here, the research applies random in the random selection. So, second step is the figure out the of weighted of the subgroups. The researcher evaluates the proportion in which the subgroup exists in the population. He or she maintains the proportion in the sample in using the type of sampling method. Right. Next, please. Sige. All right. For the third step is select an appropriate sample size. In the third step, the researcher should select the sample size which maintain the proportion evaluated in the previous step in the population size. For example, the 500. The researcher can pick the sample 50 elements. All right. So step 4, conduct surveys according to the quotas defined. Make sure that to stick the predefined quotas to achieve actual account actionable results. Don't survey quotas that are full and focus on completing surveys for each quotas. Right. Next. So that would be all, and thank you for listening.
Okay, so a while ago, our presenter mentioned about the quota sampling and clustered sampling at the same time, no? Now, in the clustered sample, no, or a cluster sampling can be more efficient than simple random sampling, especially where a study takes place over a wide geographical region. So, for instance, it is easier to contact lots of individuals in a few GP practices than a few individuals in many different GP practices. No? Disadvantages include an increased risk of bias if the chosen cluster are not representative of the population, resulting in an increased sampling error. Okay? Again, in a convenience sampling, it is perhaps the easiest method of sampling because participants are selected based on availability and willingness to take part. Useful results can be obtained, but the results are prone to significant bias because those who volunteer to take part may be different from those who choose not to. And the sample may not be representative of other characteristics such as age or gender or sex. No? We need to take note that volunteer bias is a risk of all non-probability sampling methods. Okay? When it comes to quota sampling, no, this method of sampling is often used by market researcher, as I mentioned earlier. No? Okay, so